Well, hello and welcome to the Ask Me Anything About Empower 3 live webinar. I'm Neil Lander, your host for today. So welcome everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join us this morning. At least it's morning here on the East Coast of the U.S. So this is the first time that we're holding this webinar, and our plan is moving forward to do these on a quarterly basis. And we will keep you apprised of when the next one will be coming up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out with some questions that we received when you registered for the event. And I'll talk about those, and we'll provide the answers for how to do the things that you were asking about. Then we're going to go to Empower, and I'm going to take some live questions from the audience and hopefully provide the answers that you're seeking, and then we'll have a little summary and we'll wrap up. So just a couple of notes. Please use the question and answer feature to submit questions during the webinar. And because we have a limited amount of time, we will get to as many questions as time allows. Any questions that we don't get to, I will have a copy of at the end, and we'll write to each one of you personally with the answers to the questions that we don't get to during this session. Upon conclusion, there'll be follow-up email that you'll receive, which will include a link to the recorded webinar, and again, questions that we couldn't get to during the event. So since we're doing this remotely, you can see my picture there, and also my email address, which I believe you have, but just in case, I have a middle initial in my email address, so please be sure to put that in so I receive your email, and the URL for the Tip of the Week blog, which is waters.com/empowertips, and feel free to share that with your colleagues. I have been with Waters since 1994, and when I first started out, I was a technical support specialist in the field in the eastern part of the United States. I then joined the customer training group, and I actually spent a number of years there doing software training, originally on our Millennium software product, which is the predecessor to Empower, and then I actually managed the group for a number of years. In January of 2015, I moved into the informatics group, and I've been there, and I provide a lot of internal support for Empower, as well as working with customers such as yourselves, to hopefully come up with solutions to make your life easier in the laboratory. So as I always say, email me with questions. I'll be happy to do my best and get back to you as quickly as I can with answers. So now let's move on to some of the questions that we received. Again, when you registered for the event, these are some of the questions that we received, and I thought I would start by going through these and showing you the solutions to these questions. So the first question says, my method calls for averaging the area of replicate injections of my peak and then using the averaged area to quantitate the amount of analyte in the sample. How do I set up Empower to do this? Now this is a great question, and I'll tell you why it's a great question. Typically we run replicates of the sample, and we quantitate each individual sample, and then we calculate the average result. What this person wants to do is they want to average the area for the replicate injection and have that compared to the calibration curve and quantitate that way around. So it's really a great question. So what we need to do is, first of all, we have to create a custom field which is an intersample calculation to get the average area. And so the syntax in this particular case for the intersample calculation is label, .injection number, .channel, .function, and in parentheses field. And in this case, the function is average. So we want to average the area of the peak for the replicate injections. You'll notice also I have set the sample type to unknowns only because we only want the average for the samples. Now, the next part, and this will give us the average. So then let's take a look at the next part to the answer. So here, if we think about the equation for a line that we learned in some math class many years ago, we know it's y equals mx plus b. M being the slope and b being the y-intercept. Well, in Empower, it's listed as y equals bx plus a. So b is the slope and a is the y-intercept. So if we solve for x, which is our amount or concentration, our equation is x equals y minus a divided by b. So the math isn't terribly complicated. Now, what we need to do is we want the y, or the response, to be the average area. So that first custom field will calculate the average area. Now, if we use that in the equation here, then we'll be able to solve for x, which will be the concentration or the amount based on that average area. Now, one thing I recommend to you is that I always reference the very last standard. So if I'm running 5 standards, I'll reference the A and B from the very last standard so that you are using the final coefficients for this equation. And now, pardon me, we see the result. It still calculates automatically the amount for the individual sample, but now we see for the 2 injections of this particular sample, we see the amount calculated based on the averaged area. So thanks for that great question. That is really a great question. And by the way, if anybody has questions on any of the things you see here, please ask. Here's the second question, and actually I've had this one multiple times. Will Empower report the maximum pressure of a chromatogram? So you know that on most modern pumps, you can have an additional channel of data collected, which would be your pressure trace. And we use that pressure trace for diagnostic purposes many times. So if we wanted to report the maximum pressure of a chromatogram, here's what we need to do. First of all, what we want to do is we want to report the pressure during the course of that chromatogram. So in the custom fields, if you make a simple peak custom field, there is a field called Y value, and that will allow you to report the Y value of your channel, whether it's pressure, temperature, whatever it is you happen to be collecting, because you could collect temperature as well. And so Y value, and in the square brackets, you'll notice it says retention time. So that's going to report the pressure at every retention time across the chromatogram. Or in this case, it's not going to be a chromatogram, it's a pressure trace. All right? And then I make another custom field, which is a result custom field, that just says report the maximum pressure. So the first custom field is going to report pressure throughout the run. This one's going to report the maximum pressure. Well, let's look at the results. So here are the results. Now, I didn't show the pressure trace here. It's not terribly exciting, but what you can see here, and this is in the review window, if you go to the results area of the review window, which is the tool with the little equals symbol, and you can see in the peaks table, here are all the individual pressures that Empower has recorded. And then if you look in the chromatogram result table, there's the result of my result custom field, the maximum pressure. And I just highlighted the value here. You can see in the table it's going up, up, up. There's the maximum, and then it comes down, and that maximum pressure is documented here. So that's a great question, and I've actually had that a few times. So thanks for that good question. All right. Here's another very good question that came in with the registration. I want to learn how to prepare the custom scoring reports that are included in several Waters applications, such as, and if you go to the Waters website and you type in the number, as you see here in the slide for this app note, it'll bring that app note up for you. And he wants to, the goal is to implement a systematic method development protocol. So this is a great question, and I've actually had some of my colleagues here at Waters ask me the same thing. How do I create that scoring report? Well, let's first take a look. Here is a snippet of the scoring report, and there are actually several different types of scoring reports that you can have, but this is one that's in the application note that was mentioned. And you can see what happens is there are different parameters if I was doing method development, different critical parameters such as the total number of peaks. We want to have the maximum number of peaks, and we want to have good resolution between the peaks. So you see it says how many peaks have a resolution of greater than or equal to 2.0. Of course, the better the separation, the better the sensitivity, and the easier it will be to quantitate the various analytes. Total peaks tailing less than or equal to 1.5. We want to have symmetrical peaks. We don't want to have fronted or tailing peaks. So the lower that value, again, the more symmetrical the peak is, the easier it will be to integrate the peak and quantitate that peak. What's the lowest resolution? What's the minimum K-prime? You know, in method development, at least when I was learning to do HPLC, which granted was a long time ago, we would optimize our K-prime somewhere between 2 and 10. Anything less than 2, the peak is coming out too close to the solvent front. Anything greater than 10, you're waiting a long time for that peak to come off the column. So we want to try to optimize that, and here we can see the smallest K-primes. And then what's the retention time of the last peak? We're always concerned that when we develop a new method, that we want to have a short run time so that we can do as many samples as possible. So this report nicely summarizes some of those key parameters so that we can pick out the best conditions under which to run the method. So then the question becomes, where do all of these different things come from? And each of these are actually custom fields. And then those custom fields have been incorporated into the table within the report. So I thought, why don't we take a look at one of these, which is the resolution. And it's a two-part custom field. And the first part is a simple peak custom field, but it uses Boolean logic. And what Boolean logic simply does is it says, does something meet a condition, yes or no? That's all it is. So if it meets the condition, it returns a 1, which is a yes. If it doesn't meet that condition, it returns a 0, which is a no. And you can have it say pass, fail. You can actually put in whatever text you'd like it to return. So here what we're looking at is the USP resolution greater than or equal to 2? And actually it's 2.0. So what's going to happen is for every integrated peak in the chromatogram, it's going to look to see, is the USP resolution for the peak and the one in front of it greater than or equal to 2.0? So that's going to return a bunch of yeses and nos. And then what we do is we simply add up all the ones that had a yes. So first we determine, is the resolution greater than or equal to 2.0? And for all of the ones that meet that condition, we add up the total number of peaks. So if I just go back to the scoring report, you can see the number of peaks, the total number of peaks that meet that set of conditions in each of these 3 experiments. And I didn't go through the rest of these, but they're very, very similar in terms of how you put them together. All right. So that's a great question. Thank you for that question. So now with that being done, it's time to take questions from the audience. And what I'm going to do is I am going to share my screen so that you'll be able to see Empower. So let me do that. Hopefully we can all see that. Okay. All right. Good. Excellent. All right. So let's take a look at some of the questions that are coming in here. The first one says, I sometimes work with complex samples and I need to set multiple peak width threshold events. Is there a way to estimate what values to put to detect a certain peak via peak width or threshold? Perhaps some data in the peak table. In essence, how to figure out the peak width for a certain peak and use that data to set peak width detection event. Same for threshold. So this is a great question. And actually, it's not an unusual question. Let me open up a project. And let's go. I wonder if my screen is a little bit too big. Let me just adjust my screen size here. All right. So now, let's go take a chromatogram. And I'm just going to take a very simple chromatogram because to answer this question, we don't necessarily need something terribly complex. So let's just take a chromatogram. Okay, now let me optimize the screen for you so you can see things reasonably well. Okay, so now I could ask the question, are you using the traditional algorithm or are you using the apex track algorithm? And it really doesn't matter because it works pretty similar in both cases. But let's say that I was going to work with the apex track algorithm. And so if I was to go and make a new processing method, I can choose my apex algorithm or the traditional. And this is LC data, so that's fine. It's two-dimensional data. I click OK. And so what I could do is the following. I could say, I'm going to go set my time over which I would like to have integration. So let's say 0.6 to 4.5. And I come back and I click integrate. Okay. So now with apex track, it's automatically determined the optimum peak width and the optimum threshold. So now to the question that was presented, how could I optimize in peak width and threshold? So there's a couple of ways that we can do that. And let's say that we wanted to optimize the peak width for this section of the chromatogram. We could highlight the peak. We could come up and click the peak width button. Now in this case it tells me it's the same value, but let's say that was a different value. Let's say it was a value of 10, for example. What I could then do is I could come in before this peak. I could right-click, add event, and wherever I right-click, it sets the time for that particular event to start. And here in the list, I have set peak width. And then I could put in my new value. Let's just say it was 10. Now, just a point of importance here. You notice there's no stop time. Any timed event that begins with the word set will not have a stop time. So that means when I put that event in from 3.3 minutes to the end of the chromatogram, the peak width value and power is going to use as 10. If I want to reset it, I can put a second event in and I can set it back, or I can set it to some other value. One thing I also recommend is tick the box that says Show Integration Events on Plot, because that will give you a vertical marker to show you where the event is. So if you need to move it slightly, you can just drag the line one way or the other. And then I go and I click Integrate, and I've optimized the peak width for that particular peak. Same thing with the detection threshold. If I was looking at a portion of the baseline and I wanted to optimize the threshold, I could zoom in, I could hit threshold, and I can optimize and then put in a value that would be appropriate for that section of baseline. Once I do that, of course, then I would hit integrate, and we would see the effects of any of these changes that we've made. Now, one of the things about threshold, one more piece that I want to bring up, in the integration portion, we have the liftoff percentage and the touchdown percentage. Now, this is unique to apex track. So this adjusts how Empower looks for the the starting and the end point for the baseline to be drawn in under the peak, which ultimately affects your areas and heights that it calculates. So with these as well, we could put in events. So here's a global event, and the value is 0 by default. If I change it to something else, it's going to affect globally. When I hit integrate, if I want to change something based on time, the same thing. I could right-click, add event, and then I have the set liftoff percentage and set touchdown percentage, which I can add as events as well. So just to conclude, we have our global values, which we set here, and it's the same for the traditional algorithm. We could highlight a peak. We can check out what the optimum peak width is, and then we can put in a timed event to adjust the peak width for that section of the chromatogram. Okay? Great. So that's a very good question. Thank you very much. Let's go see what our next question is. Can we do peak width on the narrowest peak? Yes, of course. As a matter of fact, I know in the traditional algorithm, we always recommend when you're setting the peak width, integrate the narrowest peak and click the peak width button. Here I can show you how to do that. It's really pretty straightforward. So if I was going to make a method and I was going to use the traditional algorithm, okay, what I do is I just draw in a baseline under the narrowest peak of interest. I click the peak width button, and now it sets the peak width to the narrowest peak. Now, if you're not sure which one is the narrowest peak, this happens to be an isocratic run, so of course I picked the first peak. You could always add the width field to your table. And if I click integrate, it shows me the width in seconds for all my peaks, and you can see of all the big main peaks, that first one is indeed the narrowest peak. All right? Let's see. Let's take another question. What is the difference between average by none, amount, or level in components in the processing method? Great question. So to answer this, let's do the following. Let's take the whole sample set. Let's have a look at the whole sample set. And the reason I'm doing this is, in this sample set, I've got 3 injections of each standard. So this is a great question. If I go to make a processing method, and here it makes no difference whether you're using traditional or Apex Track. It's independent of that. If I go to the Components tab as the person is asking the question, average by none. So that's the default. So what does that mean? So here I've got 3 standards, 3 injections each. So what I'm going to end up with is, if, let's go to a real chromatogram there, not the blank. Here I've got 3 main components. And let's say I want to quantitate all 3 components. So what I'm going to end up with is 3 standards, 3 injections each. I am going to get 3 calibration curves, each with 9 points. That's because this is set to average by none by default. Okay. What about average by amount? What does that mean? So if I go to alter sample, and this is a little bit outside of what you can see, I think. Let me size this a bit here. Okay. So if I look at alter sample for my sample set, and I click the amount tool, here I can see, hopefully, for my 3 standards, these are the amounts for the 3 analytes in each vial. So if I say average by amount, what's going to happen is it is going to average the response for the 3 replicate injections for standard 1. It's going to average the response for the 3 replicate injections of 2. It's going to do the same thing for 3. And then you're going to get a calibration curve with 3 average points for each component. What about average by level? So in your sample set method, there's a level field. Now in this case, I didn't use it. But if I came in, and let's say I put in level 1, level 2, and, whoops, level 3. Okay, so what does that mean, and what is that going to do? Again, if I say average by level, it's going to say, oh, you've made 3 injections of the level 1 standard, and it's going to average those, and it'll be equivalent to average by amount. But what if I call all of these a level 1 standard? What's then going to happen if I say average by level? It's going to look to any standard with the same level and average them together. So in that case, I would get a calibration curve with 1 average point based on the 9 injections. Right? I hope that makes sense. Okay. So let's see, where are we in the questions? We've got lots of good questions coming in. How to get a value for peak width that would only integrate the widest peak. Well, to do that, I would say, let me go back to the chromatogram so we can see the picture. This is probably not a great example. If I was going to only integrate the widest peak, depending on where the peak was, what you could do is you could either optimize the integration for that, or you could set in a very wide peak width to get it to integrate that peak. But it would be far easier in this case to perhaps just ignore the other peaks and set up my integration around that particular peak. So either A, increase the peak width wide enough so that it only picks up the wide one, or B, maybe just adjust your parameters around the peak of interest, ignoring the others. Here's a great question. Why doesn't the set events have a stop time? What is the reasoning behind this? Unfortunately, I don't know. That's the way it was designed. So the workaround is to simply put in another event to either reset it to the original value or set it to a different value. Okay? Let's see, what else do we have? How can I use export methods to report system suitability and sample results to LIMS system? I have export method that will transfer sample results as selected in the export method table. How can I have the same method transfer the suitability information? How can I streamline that information for certain selective injections? So I would need a bit more information there. My immediate response would be, if you've already got an export method that is exporting your sample results, you could just modify that export method to include the fields for your system suitability, depending on what it is you calculate for system suitability. Everybody has a slightly different way that they define it. So, for example, and again, I need a little bit more information to give you a proper answer, but let's say we just make an export method here, right? Let's make an export method. So I'm just going to give this a name, and I'll define where I'm going to export it to, which for this purpose is not terribly important, but let's fill in all the fields the way you would normally as you make your method. Somewhere in here I had an export folder. Okay, we'll just put it there. Okay, and then you have the ability to either report an individual result, or you could do a summary. So I would say, based on your question, if you wanted to streamline things, you could do a summary by all so that it would summarize multiple samples. And then you can come down to export table data, tick the box, click edit, and then you can decide what fields you want to export. So let's say as part of your normal export method, you have something like the name of the compound and maybe the concentration of the compound, right? Now, if you wanted to, you could then go to the sys_suit_peak, and then you could pick the system suitability fields that empower reports. That is, of course, assuming you have it turned on in your processing method and it is calculated. And then we could begin to put in things like, our plate count and our tailing factor and whatever else that might be important. So then those things would be included in one report. If you wanted to have a separate report and you wanted to report system suitability on particular injections, as I think you were describing in your question, then I would have a separate export method that would only have the system suitability fields and then select the injections made for system suitability and export the results with this particular method that would only concentrate on SysSuit. So I need a little bit more information, but you could certainly include the SysSuit in your existing export method, or you could make a separate one and then just export the SysSuit injections with that export method. I hope that makes sense. Okay. So where are we now? Let's see. Can export method transfer system suitability information for the run? Yeah, that's kind of what we just talked about. So, with export methods, there's a couple of ways you can export. You can make a report that already contains your system suitability results, and you could export that. Or, as I was just talking about, you could go to the Fields tab when you make an export method and select the fields that you want to export. And one thing I didn't show, but since we're still here, I would put some sample information along this, otherwise you won't know what sample it is. So you might want to at least include the sample name and maybe the injection number so that you have some identification as to what it is you're looking at. All right? So, yeah, absolutely. Now let's see. How do you create a column database using custom fields? A column database. Trying to see if I understand that question. It's a great question if I'm interpreting the question correctly. So about a year ago, I'll show you this. A colleague of mine, this is way too big. Let me size this better so we can all see it. A colleague of mine came to me with the following question, and I don't know if this is what you are alluding to. You can tell me. He said to me, I want to be able to go into Empower and put in a part number for a column and have it populate a whole bunch of fields like the length of the column, the internal diameter, the particle size, the chemistry, whatever. And so I did that, and I'll show you how it's done, but I hope I'm interpreting your question correctly. So if you see here column part number, if I click, I made a list of fake part numbers, but just to demonstrate the purpose of how this works. And when I pick that column part number, it populates the column length, the column ID, and the particle size. Now, how do you get that to work? And this is not as complicated as it may seem. So let's go over to our Custom Fields tab in this particular project, and let's look. So column part number is a sample custom field, and it has data type enumerated. So let's open this up, and I'll show you what this looks like. So it's a sample custom field, which means it's per sample, and you can define this in your sample set method, or you can define this in alter sample after you've collected your data. And the data type is enumerated. So what does that really mean? That means that I can create a list of choices. So what I did was I made this, and I put in these fake part numbers, but obviously you could put in the real part numbers for the different columns you have in the laboratory. And so this allows me to come into the sample set method or post run and alter sample, grab my sample set, go to alter sample, and when I click, you noticed how I was able to pick from the list. So that's my initial custom field. Now, how do the rest of the custom fields work? Right? Let's take a look. So if we look at, for example, if I can find it in my big list here, particle size. Here's one of them. Okay? Let's open that custom field. Let's see what is this doing. So what I did was made another sample custom field enumerated, but this time the data source is calculated, meaning it's going to make a calculation here. The last example, it was just a keyboard entry. So here I have, for the 4 columns, here are the different particle sizes, 1.7, 2, 5, and 10. So what happens is the following. I use the enum function in this particular custom field, and it says, what is this here, this piece here? Let me do something here. It's hard to see this here, so I'm going to go out on a limb here. And I'm going to open Microsoft Word, and I'm going to paste the formula into Word. Now, hopefully you can see this a little bit better. Let me increase the font size. Okay, so these are Boolean expressions. Got a mathematical function in there. It's got a field from Empower and a value. And remember from our discussion earlier, a Boolean expression is, does something meet a condition, yes or no? So what's happening here is, each one of these little Booleans, does the column part number equal to position 0, position 1, position 2, or position 3? And I'll show you where those positions come from. Now, only one of these can be true. So enumerated says, okay, evaluate, starting from the left side to the right side, these expressions. The first one to give a yes, stop. So if it equals to column position 1, whatever part number was in that position, that's the one it's going to grab. Okay? So if we go back, and we go to our column part number, just to go right back to it for one moment. These are the positions here, okay? So, back in my project, sample set, I go into alter sample since I've already collected my data. You see when I pick a column part number, now I'm picking one in the second position. It goes off and it says, oh, it equals the second position, so it looks in the table and it says, that's the second one on the list, so that's particle size 2. Now, are you limited to just these 3 fields, length, ID, and particle size? No. You can put in as many as you want. And once you make the initial list of column part numbers, as you get new columns in the laboratory, you can simply add to it. All right? So that's a great question. Now, I hope I've interpreted your question correctly in terms of a column database using custom fields. And if not, you have my contact information. Don't hesitate to reach out to me, and we can get into more of the details of what you're hoping to do. Okay, so let's see what's next. There's a question that says, I have a small peak between peaks of interest and want to calculate the resolution between the 2 peaks, ignoring the little peak in between. Okay, that's another really great question. And actually, it's a question that does come up a fair amount. So I'm glad somebody has asked that question. So let's take this chromatogram we were working with earlier. Even though it's a simple chromatogram, it will illustrate the point quite nicely. So let me make a new method here. I'll just make a quick method. And again, I think from about 0.6 to 4.5 will be adequate for this purpose. And knowing this data, I'm going to change the touchdown percentage because these peaks tail a little bit. All right, and let's see here. What if we take this peak here? It's got an area of 2117. And let's set the minimum area to that, and we'll integrate. Okay, so now I'm going to fill from result. And I'm just going to call the peaks 1, 2, 3, 4. Good enough. So here's my method. Give it a name. And we'll just call this November 15th for today. Good enough. Great, so I have a method and it works well. Now, if I had a sample and I integrate, all of a sudden I've got this little peak over here. It has no name, maybe I wasn't even expecting this peak, and I want to get the resolution between these two big peaks. Now classically, resolution is defined as the resolution between a peak and the one in front of it. So how we can get around that is with the system suitability option. So I'll turn on syssuit. I'll put in my void volume. And I'll come over to the Components tab. And we have a field called Relative Resolution Reference right there. Let me move that field all the way over here next to our peak names. So if I want to get the resolution between peak 3 and peak 2, ignoring this peak, what I do is, on the row for peak 3, in the Rel Resolution Reference field, I select peak 2, I go back, I integrate, calibrate in this case because it is a standard, and now I have the relative resolution between peak 3 and peak 2. Let's get rid of the scientific notation there. We don't need that, and the resolution, it's good enough. Now, just to complete the story, here is the resolution that it calculates by default. So the resolution between peak 3 and the little peak is here. The resolution between peak 3 and peak 2 is here. So a simple solution to the question, and it's a very, very good question, so I appreciate it because it does come up periodically. Great, thank you. What is the difference between Apply Method Set and Integrate button? Great question. So part of the answer to that also is, what type of data are we dealing with? Okay? But let's demonstrate the difference. That's the nice thing about working with the live software. I can just easily show you the difference here. Okay, so here's a sample set. And let's see here. Let's get a method set, and let's put in a processing method, right? Where's the one we made? There it is, November 15th. Okay, terrific. And we'll save this method set, and we'll call it November 15th. Okay, so what's the difference? And so the difference is the following. If I click Integrate, oh wait, let me open the method set. That would help. Sorry. There it is. Okay. So if I click Integrate, then it only applies the peak detection and integration parameters of the processing method. Notice there's no name. It just has a peak with an area and a height. If I apply the method set, then it opens the method set and it follows the instructions in the method set. Now it says, okay, I'm going to apply the method set and I'm going to integrate and calibrate or integrate and quantitate, whether it's a standard or a sample. Now the peak has a name. Of course, it's looking for the other peaks and they're not there. But if I go to the next chromatogram and I apply the method set, now everything is as it should be. This is also critical if I'm working with, and this is not PDA or MS data, but if I'm working with any derived channels that I've defined in the channel table, applying the method set will tell Empower to look in the channel table, and if there were extra channels with particular processing methods, it would follow whatever instructions are here in this table. So it's going to depend a little bit on the data that you're working with, but even this simple data, integrating simply applies the detection and integration parameters. It does no more than that. Good question, thanks. How does fill from result work? So what happens, you saw me using that just a little while ago, right? So let's clear the integration, and let's go to the Components tab, and let's wipe out the table. So once I integrate something, if I want to give the peaks names, I could go to the Components tab in the Processing method and I could manually fill out the information. That's too time-consuming because then you're going to have to put in the retention time and the retention time window and a bunch of other information. What the Fill from Result tool does, it says, okay, I'm going to look at the chromatogram, and for every integrated peak that you've got, I'm going to fill in a line of information, at least the basic necessary information that I'm going to need in the future, like the retention time and the retention time window, so that moving ahead in the future, I can identify the peaks properly. So when I click the tool, it asks me this question about cross-channel internal standard processing. We're not doing that here. So if I say no, it populates the table with generic peak names, retention time window, match criteria, and if I'm going to do calibration and quantitation, some very basic information, like I want to have the x-axis of my cal curve be amount, the y-axis area, and I want a linear fit. Of course, you can modify these things, but at least you have something to start with. Of course, now I could come in and I could say, you know, this is an impurity, if I could type properly, and this is, you know, analyte 1, analyte 2, and so forth and so on, so that when I go back to the main window and I click Calibrate, now it applies the names. So that Fill from Result tool is really a nice little tool. It saves the tedious step of filling in line by line information about my peak. Great question. Okay, where are we now? Okay, here's another question. Can I calibrate and quantitate my standards in one processing? I do not want to go to Process as Standards, then go to Alter Sample and change the sample type to Unknown and reprocess. Is this possible? Yes, it is possible. And I have had this question before. So let's do the following. I am going to view as injections, and I am going to take my standard injections to illustrate how to do this. And I'm going to make a process-only sample set. You don't have to do this. I'm just doing this to simplify my answer, and I'll show you what you do here. It's pretty straightforward. Okay. So what I'm going to do is, I'm not going to process any of these just yet. And then what I'm going to do is, I'm going to add my clear calibration line. I'm going to calibrate, and I'm going to quantitate. Okay? And I'm going to use my November the 15th method set that we made. And for the label reference, I don't really need it in this case, but if it was part of a bigger sample set, I would put that in. Okay? So there is my calibrate and quantitate. So what this is going to do is it's going to tell Empower to calibrate the standards, generate calibration curves, and then go back and quantitate. So let's go to the Amount tool, and I am going to copy my peak names from my new processing method, which is November 15th. Okay, and that's all done and good, and I click OK, and I save all the changes. Yes. Okay, then I take this, right-click, process, and we're going to process it with the method set called November 15th. Actually, we don't even need to do that. We can just say acquisition method set. That's good enough. It's going to follow the instructions in the table. Ooh. What happened to my window there? There it is. Sorry. All right, so let's go look at the result set. Okay, so what has happened is, because I've told Empower, okay, Empower, calibrate and quantitate the standards, it's going to process each standard twice. Of course, I have to add to my table my amount or my concentration. I don't have those visible. Sorry about that. Okay, so there's my amount as a standard. And if you're unclear, go into the properties of the chromatogram. And you can go over to Legend, and then you can click on, I think it's under Sample. Oh, where is it? Goodness, there's one that says Processed As. Well, I can't find it for the moment, but there is one that says Processed As. Here it is. It's under Results. Okay. That we don't need. There we are. So in the one case, it processed it as a standard, and in the next case, it processed it as a sample. So here is the standard value, which was 0.02 that we put into the component editor. And if I go to the next one, here it is as a sample. And it does that for every single standard that you told it to do so. So it can calibrate and quantitate in one go without having to change anything and without having to reprocess. So that's a very good question. Thanks for that question. Let's see, how are we doing for time? I think we have time for one more here. Are there any more? You scroll down here. How can I be sure I'm seeing the final result for a sample if I have processed multiple times? This is a very good question. I know particularly when you are reviewing large amounts of data and you want to see, is this the last result? Sometimes it can be a bit tricky. So what I have done, and I will show this to you, is we have a couple of custom fields that I made, and it's actually quite simple to do. The first one I called Final Result, and let me show that to you. So Final Result is another intersample calculation, and all I did was, again, remember the syntax is label.injectionNumber.channel. In this case, I'm going to use the mathematical function of max. Result number is a standard field in Empower. So I'm basically saying, give me the maximum result number for a particular sample. So if I've processed it 5 times, 5 would be the maximum. Okay, so that's the first custom field that's involved. And then the second one that's involved is called latest result. And then I'll show you how this works. Okay, which I don't see here. Oh, yeah, that's because I called it result latest. Sorry. All right, there it is. So the first custom field just says, hey, what's the maximum result number that I have for that sample? Okay, if I did it 5 times, it's a 5. This is a result field, but again, using Boolean logic. And all it says is, if the final result equals the number of results stored, tell me it's okay. Tell me that that is indeed the last result for that sample. So it's, again, the simple Boolean logic where we're saying if this field equals the number of results stored, all is good. All right? So what happens is if we take a look and we go to results, and let's take a look. You can see over here, I made a view filter in the results table that shows me the result number, the number of results stored, the final result. Is the result the latest? Here in this particular case, The result number is 86. There are 86 stored. Therefore, the final is 86, and it's okay. You notice the one before it says no because it's not. So I know we're running out of time here, but again, if anybody has any questions about this, please reach out to me because this could save you some time in reviewing all of your results at the end of the day. All right, so I'm going to stop the Empower screen here. And let me get rid of that. So where are we in the slides? Let me just get back to where we were here. Because one last thing that I want to talk to you about, and we can wrap up. Okay, a little summary, couple of points, and one thing I do want to show you. We are considering, and we need your opinion, as to whether or not the tip of the week, should we do videos? Today, you know, you go to the tip of the week, you see the text with the screenshots, and we have been talking about possibly doing them as videos. So not doing away with the current format, but maybe supplementing it with some video tips so that you can see how I click through the screens. We're also fast approaching tip number 100, and we're going to do something special for that, so stay tuned. Finally, a number of you have reached out to me and you've said, you know, I go out, I see the list of tips, but I can't search. And no, you can't. So we have a Waters knowledge base that was created, I think it was last year, I could be wrong, and that's actually a searchable database. And what I'm doing is I'm taking the tips and I'm moving them into this database so that you can go to the database and you can search there for those tips. So there's a couple of ways of getting to this particular database. You could do it from the Waters website. That's one way. So if you go to the service and support, you will see the Waters knowledge base. And when you click on that, three main areas, and informatics right in the middle, that's the one you'll want to select. And here in informatics, we have Empower Tip of the Week. So with a couple of clicks, you'll get there. If you click on that, now you'll get to all of the tips. Not all of them, because I haven't moved all of them over into the database yet. I think there is about 18 or 20 of them in there. And as I said, we're getting close to 100. But you do have a search bar, and then you'd be able to search on a topic to find a tip that would be appropriate. This knowledge base has a lot of other information besides just my tips. So, you know, stuff about instruments and methods and so forth and so on. There's a lot of information here. So as a customer, you know, you can take advantage of that. You don't need to be logged in with Waters. You can just go and you can search. All right. So I think that brings us to the end. We thank you for your attention. And again, this is the first time that we've run this, so I hope it's been useful. I hope you've learned some things. Don't be shy. Please reach out to me with questions. We should have a new tip that's probably been posted today, which I think is tip 95, so stay tuned for that. And again, thank you so much for being with us today. We appreciate it. Take care and all the best.